And now if I can ask the Minister Clarke, to come to the podium for his presentation.
Madam Master of Ceremonies, Ministers of Government, I believe Minister Shahini Robinson is here, members of the Diplomatic Corps, I know the EU Ambassador is here, the High Commissioner from Canada is here, I believe the head of USAID is here, and the Ambassador from Japan is here, members of Parliament, and I see Member of Parliament Mark Golding, welcome. Leadership of the World Bank, our special guest, Vice President of the World Bank and my good friend, Jorge Familia. Please give him a big round of applause and welcome him to Jamaica. Jorge is a leader and we want to claim him as our Vice President. We have our own Vice President at the World Bank. Permanent secretaries, leaders in the public sector and in the private sector, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, good afternoon. And no man, look at the set. You can't say good afternoon in a set like that. I mean, this looks more like the X Factor than a conference on disaster, right? I guess that's the idea. I've been looking for my chance, If those reality shows were around when I was a teenager, I'm sure, as we say in Jamaica, I'd have bust by now. So I'm delighted to have a full audience for a discussion on this topic. Jamaica is doing very well. Poverty is at an 11-year low. Growth in the first quarter of the financial year is the highest it has been in a decade for the first quarter. Inflation has been stable and low for a number of years. And the latest news is that unemployment came out last week at the lowest level ever recorded in Jamaica. I literally went back and checked the records myself. And as far back as we could go, or went back as beyond 40 years. And the persons at Statin have confirmed the lowest level ever recorded. Now, as great as that is, we all know from experience that that could be eroded. Oh, and I should say debt has gone down from 147% of GDP to be on target to being below 100 for the first time this century. Yeah? But as wonderful as that is, and that of course reflects an effort over consecutive administrations, as wonderful as that is, it could disappear overnight in a single event. We had a little experience with it last year with the rains that fell in Montego Bay. In one day, there was more rain in one day in Montego Bay than over what normally takes place over 7 months. And the drains were full and the city was flooded. We lost money, businesses lost money, there was a fiscal cost. So the vulnerability of Jamaica to devastation of natural disasters is well known. We know it from our experience. The earthquake in Haiti in 2010, we remember that. We remember what happened in Dominica last year. The cost was over 250% of GDP. Natural disasters destroy our crops, they destroy our homes, they suppress revenue. It means in the aftermath of a natural disaster, you have to import a lot of stuff, and therefore your foreign exchange comes under pressure at exactly the wrong time. Expenditures go up. It just takes you completely off track. You make 3 steps forward only to make 5 steps backwards. We can no longer take the approach that we have taken in the past of just dealing with it when it happens. Because to do so is a recipe for dependency. And hence, X factor set. Because we have to begin to speak about this in an explicit way and in a real way. A recent World Bank study on the financing of natural disasters shows that the regularity and severity of natural disasters that have hit Jamaica since 1988, and I think I have a chart on this, resulted in average annual losses of about 2.3% of GDP. We all know the names there on the x-axis. You know, Gilbert estimated at 26% of GDP in some in PIOJ reports. But then we had Charlie in 2004, 3.5%. We had Ivan, 5.7% in 2004. Dennis, Wilma, Dean, Gustav, Nicole, Sandy. We have all lived through that. And our risk profile includes low-impact events as well that occur more frequently. Now, all of these have to be financed. All of the costs that come from this, money has to come from somewhere to pay. And the regularity with which we have been having these experiences suggests that we need to plan for it and not deal with it in an ad hoc way. Most of the way in which these natural disaster occurrences are financed is by diversion of budgetary allocation. So money is allocated to ministries, departments, and agencies, allocated to important infrastructure projects, and in the event of a natural disaster, that money is diverted. Critical expenditure gets left behind. And as a result, our social and economic development is retarded. We have other approaches on the books now. We have the CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance, that insures us on a parametric basis for losses once they meet a certain level of severity. We're very pleased to complete negotiations for a contingent credit facility that you might hear more about later with the Inter-American Development Bank. But that's essentially about what we have in our arsenal, and it leaves several gaps exposed. Our public bodies, some of them insure, but not on a complete basis. We have ministries and schools and hospitals, all of which are uninsured, right? The cost of insuring them just prohibitively high. So the crux of the matter is the manner in which disaster risk is financed has got to change. It has not been very effective. If we move to the next chart, just a diagram of what the profile looks like. If you look at this, on the X, you know, we have the severity of a natural disaster, and vertically we have the frequency. And one way to think about what we want to do from a strategic perspective is for things that are high frequency, we retain the risk in Jamaica and try to finance it ourselves through possibly a number of methods, you know, having a natural disaster fund possibly, having, you know, the capacity for post-disaster borrowing, reallocation of budgetary resources, and so forth. Once the frequency is less and the severity is likely to be higher, then we need to look at transferring the risk in ways that are market-driven. And this just shows two of these, contingent credit and CRIF. There should have been one or two others, you know, catastrophe bonds in where that green is, or CAT DDOs, or many other instruments. And there'll always be a layer of residual risk that exists that's undiversifiable. But this just represents an illustration of the kind of strategic approach that we're going to need to take. And as I said, where it is green, just imagine a couple other rows that include other products as we go up on severity and down on frequency. Now, the approach that we want to take or plan to take is not one that immediately jumps for a product. It's easy to buy a catastrophe bond in the market. Any international investment bank, you know, would sell you a catastrophe bond tomorrow. or to sell you other risk transfer instruments. How we want to approach it is to develop a policy first on which we can have national consensus, where because these things cost, and because they cost, because it's ultimately a fiscal cost, it's important that we have some amount of consensus that we do want to make an explicit arrangement for these exposures. And once we have a strategy in place that has gone through the policy building steps, after that we engage in the purchase of products. Now, what makes this all very challenging is that Jamaica has very limited fiscal space. One of the charts earlier sort of showed the fixed and discretionary expenditure, and a chart that I have spoken about before and has been in the public domain, that even though our discretionary expenditure the room for it has been improving, and discretionary expenditure includes expenditure that you actually have discretion over, right? Most of our budget consists of compensation, salaries, pension, wages, and interest. And only a minority of it consists of things that you can actually make a decision over, and much of it is absorbed in capital expenditure and other things that are required. So in the reality of limited fiscal space, the urgency of the situation becomes even more apparent, that it is absolutely necessary to take a strategic approach. In addition to addressing the problem by means of transferring of risk through purchasing of product, it is also possible to spend ex ante, to spend before a disaster on resilience and on mitigation. It has been shown that $1 invested in making Jamaica more resilient to natural disasters provide benefits that are probably 3 times as great. A good example of mitigation would have been the Palisadoes Shoreline Project, where the road is at sea level and can easily be overwhelmed in a natural disaster, and overwhelming of a road such as that, making it impassable, could inflict further costs on Jamaica by making disaster relief supplies difficult to get to their intended recipients, and so forth. And therefore, the money spent to make that resilient is money well spent. The challenge, though, is that if you look at the range of options available to make our infrastructure more resilient, that cost is staggering. Putting all of our electricity lines underground, for example, which would be a great thing to be able to do to make our country more resilient, comes at a staggering price. So the strategic approach that we're going to have to take, not only does it need to balance what we spend today versus what we spend tomorrow reallocating our budget, but it also has to balance what we spend on risk transfer versus what we spend on resilience. So I'm pleased to announce, and it was announced by press release earlier today, that the Cabinet at its last meeting has approved the development of a national natural disaster risk financing policy. That deserves a round of applause. And the policy will target both pre-disaster, meaning mitigation and resilience measures, and post-disaster risk transfer measures, on how to plan for and better finance damages and losses so that natural disasters don't derail us from our objectives. And the World Bank is providing support on a technical basis, and the IDB is providing significant grant funding, and we hope to involve the IMF as far as ensuring that the strategies and plans that we put in place are consistent with our overall debt and growth objectives. The policy will provide the strategic context that allows us to prioritize these investments, and the process will be overseen by the appropriate steering committees and so forth, and importantly, it will involve stakeholders throughout society. We plan for the initial policy preparation and analysis to occur by January, and for public consultation on a green paper by March of next year, and hope to be able to proceed to, this is a very aggressive but necessary timeline, because we want to ensure that prior to the expiration of our current standby arrangement with the fund, we have at least a strategy in place. It takes time for a strategy to be executed, for sure, but we want to make sure that at least prior to October of 2019, we have a policy in place that's been tabled in Parliament, debated in Parliament, and accepted, and becomes our national disaster financing risk policy. And as Jamaica continues to do well, as growth continues and unemployment continues to decrease or remain at current levels, and the stability that we've enjoyed continues to be entrenched, and fiscal space opens up, we'll be able to engage in more resilience and more risk transfer. But until such time, we are going to engage members of the multilateral community to see what creative ways and creative things that we can work on to ensure that Jamaica can reduce its exposure as much as possible, even while we build the fiscal room to do it all ourselves. So thank you very much, and I look forward to a productive discussion.